Welcome back to the YouTube channel. I'm going to do a very fun project, or at least start a fun project today. I am really excited about this one. So, join us at Outdoor Power Equipment Forum, which is opeforum.com. If you have any questions, there's all kinds of threads on exactly what I'm about to show you. So, check it out. Also, if you need power equipment parts, aftermarket power equipment parts, check out HL Supply. There's a link down in the description of my videos, so please check them out. That's the way to do it. Okay, let's get to it. So, one thing that has never existed, to my knowledge, is a kit chainsaw. I don't think it's existed. I've never heard of one. I've never seen one. The aftermarket chainsaw parts companies have been kind of moving towards having some, or at least most parts for some Stihl and Husqvarna chainsaws. It's not until not very long ago now that all of a sudden there's a company in China that not just has assembled saws, I know that they do that too, but they also have chainsaws that are available as a kit. You can put the whole thing together. They have all the parts, just put it together. Now, it's not quite that simple because there are issues with some of the parts, but it's still a kit chainsaw. It's still a kit chainsaw, and they're really inexpensive. So right now there is a craze for these saws. What doesn't exist is bolt for bolt videos. So you're going to get them. It's going to happen. I'm going to do it. Now, I will mention right off the bat that there is another channel that is doing excellent work on these saws, and that's a Fleet Command. That's Walt. Check him out. He's great. Walt loves to give you kind of the real meat and potatoes of the whole thing, which is wonderful. But it's not bolt for bolt. So if you want super boring, check me out. If you want the meat and potatoes, check out Walt. So let's go for super boring, but you're going to get bolt for bolt on how to put these things together. I'm also going to give you some tips and tricks and whatever other nuances are in these saws. I'm going to find them, and I'm going to either put them in the description, or I'm going to use some actual OEM parts on these where the aftermarket ones are a little on the weaker side. So we're going to go through all that, and I literally have a box sitting right over here, and I'm going to take this apart and dissect it for you. This is not the only saw that I'm going to do. I'm going to do multiple of these. This is the Stihl ms660 clone, which is very popular because it's a huge saw. It's 90 cc's or something like that. It is a very, very large, very powerful saw, and it is very inexpensive for if you buy it directly from China. The downside is the shipping, but we'll get to that later. So, very excited to have this as a kit. Come with me on this adventure. We're going to have a good time. And I've got notes that I've taken on the forum and other forums, especially Arborist site, of issues that people have had. And I'm going to go through all those, if at all possible. I'm going to try to mention the people that have given me good advice and all that stuff. So, first shout out is to Walt. Thank you very much. Check out a Fleet Command's channel. I will put it down in the description. Okay. Where do we start? We start with the box. Let's look at the box. So here's the box. Now, this is not all the ms660 parts. I do have some other stuff in here, so I'm going to try to pull those out. But the box actually comes very efficiently packed. I was pretty impressed at how this is packed. I pulled this apart somewhat, but it is definitely very efficient as far as getting it packed. So let's unwrap this a little bit. Nice heavy box, and everything's kind of bubble wrapped, or at least most of the stuff is bubble wrapped. It all looks like it seems to be alright. We'll take it apart and see how we do. I'm going to remove all the kind of extra stuff that I purchased on this particular order, and we'll get right into getting this built. So the first thing we're going to start with, I think, is the crankcase. We have to put that together, and I've got a couple of ways to do that, so let's get right into that. So as I'm doing the unboxing, I just found one particular casualty. This piece here. This is busted. And since it is indeed attached to the carburetor bolts, it looks like I can replace it, but it does not look like it would be particularly easy. So maybe I'll get to replace it, maybe I won't. It's not going to matter that much for function to have a busted piece like that, but that's kind of a cruddy thing. But oh well, that's one casualty of ordering stuff from that far away. So here's the crankcase. Now, I will venture a guess as to say that the average person putting this together is going to have the hardest time getting the crank in the crankcase properly. So that is going to be kind of like a primary focus for me on this build. The rest of it is more or less just putting pieces together and dealing with whatever baloney might come your way. And there will be that. But the average person putting this together is going to have the trickiest time getting the crank in the crankcase. And my job is to make it easy. Look at all the holes, make sure they're tapped. They're all tapped. I'll give a shout out to a guy on Arborist site named Antarctica. He actually posted a picture with one of these wasn't tapped. The holes were there, but it wasn't tapped. These bolt holes are actually tapped. They should be tapped. His were not. And he was a wee bit upset about that. And to me, it's not that big of a deal because I have an M5 tap, but he didn't have an M5 tap. So to him, it was a big deal. Anyway, I believe the company just shipped him out a unit that actually was properly tapped. Okay. One of the suggestions has been, one of the first suggestions has been to take this gasket and throw it in the trash, because this is not the best case gasket you can have. So what I did was I went and ordered the Oem Gasket Kit. So you can order all kinds of gaskets and things, the seals, individually, or you can order them as a kit. If you order them as a kit, it's actually a little less expensive. So the whole gasket kit is like $45 at your Stihl dealer, and they should be able to get that for you pretty easily. So that's the first thing to do, really, is to take this and throw it away. But actually, we can use that because we're going to do a little measurement here. Put that back. So what you want to do is measure between here. And for argument's sake, it does look like that bearing here on this side is standing a little proud. And this one too. I don't know if they're fully seated or not fully seated or what, but it looks like that one's at least a little bit high. How am I going to get in there? Can I get in there to measure this? Yeah. Okay, so between the two, I don't know, bosses you might call them here, 1.324. So now what you do is you measure the crank. Uh, 1.250. Yeah. So 80 thousandths, roughly, would be the differential. So 1.250 and 1.3. Let's go back and double check it. Right, 1.330 effectively, somewhere around there. So you have about 1 inch 330 versus 1 inch 250. So the differential is 80 thousandths. Assuming you want to center the crank between these two bosses, you need 40 thousandths clearance on either side. So ideally, ideally, when you drop the crank down in here, when you push the crank in, you want the crank lobes to sit 40 thousandths off of this. So you need a 40 thousandths shim right here when you push the crank through. Okay. Like I said before, the hardest thing for the average bear to do here is going to be to get the crank through there because this is actually press fit. Because you can't physically press that in yourself. So, let's talk about a number of ways to do this. And because I've had some very interesting discussions with lots of different people, there's lots of different ways to do it. Okay, so if you watch Walt at a Fleet Command do it, he actually has a shop press. And you can watch him press that right in there, and you're good to go. If you don't have a shop press, what are you going to do? And the answer is you can use the hot-cold method. So hot-cold method being, put the crank in the freezer, warm this bearing up with a heat gun, okay? Once this is warm with a heat gun, then this will literally drop right in. If you don't have what I'm going to show you here in a minute, then probably the best way to work this is to use a heat gun and the crank in the freezer and drop it through. One of the other issues with that is that with the heat, you can not only damage the nylon cage here, and if that goes, then hairy carry, but this seal here is not immune to heat. So what's interesting about this seal is that the metal part of the seal seals up against the metal bearing itself, the outer race of the bearing, and this particular bearing has to be pressed into the case at just the right depth. Anyway, we're going to assume for argument's sake that it is pressed into the correct depth. But once I apply heat to this to get that crank in here, have I compromised the seal? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. I'd rather not it be a maybe. Let's not do maybe on seals. If you lose your crank seal, then you have an air leak. If you have an air leak, you cook the piston and cylinder. Let's not make that a maybe. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this seal. I've got a tool here that I made. You can probably just use a straight screwdriver on this. Yes, I'm taking out the factory seal. Now this is not an OEM seal, this is an aftermarket seal. So you know what would be a whole lot better, I think? Yeah. How about an OEM seal? I'll bet an OEM seal would be good. Notice one other thing. If you invert the rubber here, there is a chance that this spring will fall out. And if for whatever reason it falls out, you may never know it until again you have an air leak. So that's a no good. So let's do this the right way. What I think is the right way. Or better yet, let's do this the best way. We need to get that crank through here without putting lateral forces on the bearing, without hitting it, without jamming it, without pressing it. And we need to do it at room temperature. And we need to do it cheap. Let's do it cheap. It's not free, but it's cheap. So let's go back to the tools that I made. You can see my other videos on these. Personally, I think this is going to be the best way to do it. I'm kind of hoping that this fits. Does this fit? So officially I'm actually disappointed here. I was told by multiple different sources that the threads on the 660 crank are M12 by 1.25. That is incorrect. The 394s, the Husky 394s, and some others are actually M12 by 1.25, but the 660s are M12 by 1.0. It's a finer thread, and both left hand, but it's finer thread. So my nifty difty crank puller here will not work. I was really trying to get all this stuff, the appropriate taps, bought from China before I got this, because I really wanted to do that here, but since I don't have that, let's do the warm this up method, and once we get it hot, then we'll put the crank in. We'll do it that way, at least this side. For the flywheel side, we'll do it with the pullers, because I think that'll be a really nice demonstration. Let's take the oil dip tube out here. Yeah, it looks like it just pushes through. You don't want a sharp screwdriver here, you want a dull one. And we can actually put this in the oven. At least I'm going to put this in the oven, warm this up, rather than using the torch on this, because I do not want to damage that nylon insert there. So I'm going to put this very gingerly in the oven and warm it up and see if the crank drops in. I'm also going to put the crank in the freezer for a little bit and make sure that cools down. While I'm waiting for the oven to heat up, let's do something simple. Let's put the studs in. The studs go in this way, not that way. I'm going to use a little bit of blue Loctite. Now, you're looking at this going, saying, how in the world are you going to tighten this down? There's actually a couple of ways, but I'm going to use this way. Walt was showing how you throw a couple of washers under here and then tighten it down, or make sure this is loosey-goosey. And then what you can do is tighten one against the other, and then you can use this top one here. They don't need to be super tight. These definitely don't need to be super tight. But that's the other way to do it. So again, bring it down, loosey-goosey. And then once it's in, reverse it. While you're waiting for the oven to heat up, the other thing you can do is do an inspection. Just look around. Look on the crankcases. See what's going on. There was a piece of powder coating next to the nipple here. There's a guy named Ozhu, or whatever. On Arborist's site, he's got a great list, and I'm going to go through it here in a minute. He's got a great list of things to look out for. That's pretty much that. Now we'll just be able to take the crank and drop it right down. Yeah, 30. So if I doubled that over, sat this on in, it's going to be good to go. So let's use that. I'm going to go put this up in the oven. Wish me luck. So I'm going to get the power takeoff side crankcase, which is in the oven, baked to about 300 degrees for only a few minutes, under 10. We're still not quite hot enough. Another few minutes. Should be pretty hot. Put the shim on. Make sure your lobes are going to hit it. Make sure you're going in the right way. And go. And that's it. That's bad. Whoa, I guess this came out. That's not particularly good. Okay. Well, that certainly is one of the issues with that. Nope, will not go on. Well, that's an interesting issue. Let's see if we can remedy that. Temporarily putting the oil pump on. So one of the tricks with this whole kit is figuring out what bolt goes where. It's worse when you don't have the right bolt, or they don't supply you with the right bolt. As if, for instance, the oiler bolts are actually M4. They're small thread. And the only M4 that I see, and they're also blind hole, by the way. You notice they don't come through to the crankcase. The Huskies actually come through to the crankcase, which you do have to be careful of. But anyway, the only M4 that I see is a single screw here. I think they forgot to put an extra one in. This is still hot, by the way. Temporarily take the oiler. Cinch it down with a couple of M4 screws. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take and tap the outer race on the big bearing here and make sure it's seated. Yep, that's seated. I'm going to put this back in the oven for a minute, but I'm going to take a guess that this is not hot enough to accept the crank. So let's put this back in the oven now with the oil. Unfortunately, with the oiler on, I really don't want to do that, but don't have much choice here. I'm going to put this back in the oven, see if we can warm this up enough so that bearing doesn't fall friggin' through. Right. Crank install, here we come. We're hot. And we're cold. And here's our shim. And hopefully it don't fall out the other side now. Yep, now we're good. Now we got it. How are we doing on temperature? Looks like it rolls nice. This will cool to room temperature, and then we'll get to the rest of it. Now that we're more or less down to room temperature, I'm just going to take the oiler off. Now again, these are Allen bolts that I happen to have here, but of course you're supposed to use the Stihl bolts. Pretty sure that I would, except for the fact that I think they only gave me one. So again, M4 with what looks like a T27 head, and this is a 1 centimeter long thread. Okay, so the oiler comes back off. I'm going to save these bolts with the oiler off to the side here. That way I lose them. Good. I'm going to put the oil dip tube down. Might as well do that now. And I think I'm actually going to put some 1194 on this. 1184. I put a little bit of sealant on this, why not? Filter's already on there. Gonna down and through. Work it around a little bit. Goes right in. There you have it. Piece of cake. Okay. Back here. This is oriented properly. It's not going to mess anything up. So I know I'm kind of undoing things and redoing things here, but I think this is probably going to be ultimately a really good idea. let's look at the other side case half, because this is pretty much ready to go. So let's look at this. Say, okay, well again, we can do the press. That could work. That could work. Or we could do hot cold. In other words, we can heat this up and put this entire case half in the freezer. The problem that I have with that is that when you're doing the hot and the cold and everything, and you can see how it was kind of like, oh crap, I'm out of the oven, I gotta get this in and get it out of the freezer and get it through, and hopefully it works, and if it doesn't work, then you're in trouble. So I'm really, I can do the hot and cold thing, but I don't like it. So I'd like to do something here that hopefully should be a lot easier. One other thing about the hot and cold method is that if you're putting sealer on here, which some people do and some people don't, but if you're putting sealer on here and you're trying to get something hot and something cold, I'm not sure how that actually affects the sealer. Maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, but it kind of worries me. So another worry that I have, of course, is putting lateral force on the bearings. So if you use a press, you're going to be putting lateral force on the bearings. However light it is, bearings are still not designed to do that. So if we can do this an easy way, a cheap way, and have basically zero risk, why not do that? So this is where you go check out my other videos on how to make the tool that I believe is M10 by 1 that will actually fit on the flywheel side of the crank here. So this is the M10 tool. All it is a piece of threaded rod, and instead of M10, which I didn't have, it's M10 by 1. Instead of M10 by 1, which I did not have, I used the NPT pipe thread, which comes in the cheap, basically in the cheap Harbor Freight tap and die set. So if you guys are putting saws together like this, one thing that you're going to need is, ultimately, is a tap and die set, a metric tap and die set. And the NPT, it is actually 1/8 inch NPT, works more or less as M10 by 1. So go check out that other video. It shows how I made the tool. It's very easy, it's very, very cheap, and I think will make us make our lives a whole lot easier here. So let's make sure this fits. And you can see how out of round it is, but it won't matter. So yes, that fits on that crank. That's good. So let's see exactly how easy this is. Now the other thing we're going to do here is we're going to pop this seal out. Hopefully isn't too bad. And I got to do it without buggering the chassis. Because if you put a scratch mark on the case half, you're sunk. No scratch mark. We're good. But what is that? There is debris in here. Well, it's a good thing I pulled that seal out. We don't want that. Ideally, what I'd like to do is take this, plop that on there, and with the tool, that I've got, pull the two case halves together in a very controlled manner. And the real trick is to only put pressure on the inner race, not on the outer race. So it actually looks like, because this is so tight, that this shim here is actually not going to work. This is actually the inner race to a 6203 bearing, which is exactly what these are. And it's got to fit all the way down in there onto the inner race. But it cannot because the case is in the way. So, you have to come up with a different idea. So the plan here is I'm actually going to sacrifice a scrench in the name of research here. All I need is a spacer. Doesn't even have to be that long. Is smaller diameter than the seal, but bigger diameter than the crank. So that is 866. This is 873. Wow. That's going to be very tight. But that's okay. That might actually work fine. Going to cut it in a couple of spots. Now I've got a spacer. You can machine these, you can, I mean, there's all kinds of different things you can do here. So here's my spacer. It's not perfect, it's not exact, but it should fit comfortably where the seal goes and sit on the inner race, because that's where we want to use as the pressure point to pull the crank through, or rather press this on. So once we have that, and this was just a piece of scrench, and I actually took the grinder and ground it down a bit. Once it's ground down, you're good to go. So it's about 1 inch long. So I'm looking at this, and where the spacer is, there's really not much meat here that I'm going to grab. So when I put that down, not a whole lot of threads that I'm grabbing there. Can do one of a couple of things. We actually shorten the spacer. 927 is a tad long, so if we can shorten that just a touch, I think it'll be .604 goes to the top of this nubby thing here from the inner race. So probably a spacer that's 3/4 of an inch would be just fine. Or if I want to grab more thread, I can grind some off of here too. Yeah, you know, maybe I'll do that. I'll just grind a little bit off of there. Just taper it effectively. So one of my YouTube commenters had a fantastic idea, was to get a coupling nut for this tool instead of... Oh, it's got a bump in there. Well, that's not fair. Guess I have to drill that out. So the idea is to get a coupling nut so you can run it all the way down and then run it all the way in and not have a length issue. Or not have to use washers, but for now, instead of drilling this out, I'll just use washers. Okay. Went down to my local Stihl dealer and I got this. Part number 1122007 10053. This actually is the gasket and seals kit, an OEM kit. So it has an OEM gasket. So if you want to use OEM parts, then this is probably good bang for buck here. $45 for the kit. And get the kit, don't get the individual pieces. It's actually cheaper to get the kit than it is to start buying individual pieces. So I'm just using a little solvent here. Want to clean these surfaces really well. And by the looks of it, it actually comes fairly clean from the factory. Nothing here that's going to really cause a leak. There you are. Positioning pins are both there. All the holes are indeed tapped. Pretty good. So now I'd say we're pretty much ready to put this together. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply some 1184 on both surfaces, and then I'm going to put the gasket on, and then we're going to put these two pieces together. So when you apply the 1184, you're going to do it sparingly. It can easily go everywhere. You don't want to do that, but you want to just wet the surfaces, really. This is Walter's favorite stuff, and I'm starting to agree with him. You really do not want too much excess. Just all surfaces fairly wet. And then you let it skin for a minute. It'll just kind of just start to cure, and you can feel it on your fingers too when this just starts to cure. It's awful thin down there. Gonna have to assume that 6 bolts, 6 bolts. That makes sense. They look like they're all the same. They look like they're 25 millimeter bolts. M5. Now, if you want to get nuts, these already have blue Loctite on them. Well, you know, let's just do the 1184, 1194 stuff. Why not? Walter does that, so let's follow what he's got. He's done this 1,000 times more than me anyway. Okay, here we go. Here is the Oem Case Gasket. Stick that right there. Make sure the holes line up pretty good. Should just stick there. Great. Now imagine if you're doing this and there's hot and there's cold and there's trying to get things together, and I don't know. I kind of worries me. I have to get the positioning pins correct. Our shim goes on. And now we're doing this all at room temperature. Okay. Screw our M10 by 1 on. And when this is in the proper spot, it's in the proper spot there. All right, our positioning pins are in. You can just start to turn this down. At room temperature, this is all room temperature. There. Everything's got to be in alignment, otherwise nothing happens. Look, it's going down. Use my Sharpie, my crank stop. Back it off a touch. As we get down towards the end, I'm going to grab a few more threads here. Okay, so where are we at? Not too much further here, and we're going to be home. Make sure nothing's in the way. Sharpie marker crank stop is in there. Or can I just do it like this? Yes, I can. Nope. Oh, that's actually it. That's actually home. It's tight now. Sharpie marker crank stop in the other way. Loose, loose. Those scratches in there. Looks pretty even to me, too. There you go. Alright. Let's do the crank bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. T27 Torx as usual. Finish them by hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 case bolts. Beauty. That's very nice. Nice and smooth. That right there has got to be the hardest part of the whole thing for your average bear. For your average guy that hasn't done a case before, that's going to be the trickiest part of the whole thing. And the rest of it is just a matter of putting pieces together, I think. So, your crankcase is together. We're going to get to the seals next, and then we'll just start putting the rest of the thing together. I'm excited. That tool works great. Case halves are indeed together. Let's call this the end of part 1. Part 2, we'll do the seals and continue with the build. If you like chainsaws and you like this video, please join us at Outdoor Power Equipment Forum, which is opeforum.com. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe.